Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Today I'm going to review these 3 wonderful airbrushes from Japan. Psych! Today we're going to be unboxing the Harder Steenbeck Infinity CRplus 2024 2-in-1 Titanium. I've been waiting for this airbrush for about a month now. I placed my order probably about 2 or 3 days after they announced that it was on the store and ready. I'd been following the videos from Warwick at Harder Steenbeck and all the development they've been doing on this airbrush throughout the year. So needless to say, I was very excited to get it. It's a little frustrating it took a month to get it, but it sounds like they had some power issues at the manufacturing plant, which sounds like they have resolved now, but now it is in my hands. So this airbrush comes with a lot of new features that Harder Steenbeck have been working on this year. There's a lot of them shown here in the back of the box. You know, a lot of these are standard features you find on an airbrush, but they do have a few features such as the quick release, needle stop. They have the new trigger, pattern, and texture, as well as some new nozzles that are made out of titanium. So we're going to go over that once we get this box open and pull the airbrush out, and we're going to take a look at all the different components inside. Alright, with the sleeve off, we have this sleek black box, plastic box with these locking clasps on it. Opens up nicely. Inside we have the spray card. This is what they spray at the factory to demonstrate that the airbrush is functioning properly. Sometimes you also see residue within the paint cup from them doing that test. Okay, so the first thing out of the box is the mini cup. This cup, I believe, is just shy of 1 milliliter. Definitely the best cup if you're only going to use a couple drops of paint. Generally, if I'm going to be doing just a bit of zinithal priming or something like that with some white ink, I'll use a small cup. Also included with this is this stylus needle guard that goes on the front of the airbrush. You can see that it really exposes the needle, and also provided a kind of a stop for you to hold the paintbrush against, like a piece of art or canvas, whatever. The next cup is a 4 milliliter cup. This is the largest cup you get with airbrush. Definitely probably pop this on if you're using the larger needle, if you got the 2-in-1. Looking inside these cups, they're pretty good finish. You know, the chrome isn't like 100% perfect, but when I feel the inside, it's very smooth. And to me, that's what's most important, because if it's rough, paint tends to get stuck in there more, and it becomes more of an issue when you're trying to clean it. Because I got the 2-in-1, it comes with this extra nozzle and front end. This is a 0.44 millimeter nozzle and needle. This is something that you would typically use if you're using or putting down a lot of paint. It'd be good for priming, stuff like that. As you can probably tell from listening to me, I do a lot of painting models and miniature painting. So that would probably be kind of what I'm viewing that this airbrush with, that kind of perspective. Alright, so we're pulling out the airbrush, and it is actually smaller than I expected and much lighter. I don't know why in my head, but when I've looked on the Harder Steenbeck website at these airbrushes, they just seem large to me and they look heavy. But now having it in my hand, I can definitely say that it's one of the smaller airbrushes that I have. I put them all on the scale and it's definitely lightest by probably 10 to 15 grams. And here on the end of the airbrush, we have the needle stop, which is used to control how much you can pull the trigger back. Unique to the Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes is that the needle stop has a quick release. You basically set the needle stop to where you want it to be, and then you can release it to allow you to pull the trigger all the way back when you're trying to clean the airbrush or get rid of paint from the cup. Looking at the bottom of the airbrush, the Harder and Steenbeck comes with a quick connector for an airbrush hose. It's nice for them to throw this in, even though it only just costs a couple bucks. With the rear guard of the airbrush off, we can see here the needle chuck and the trigger spring assembly. The needle chuck on this Harder and Steenbeck is pretty great because it's self-guiding, allowing you to push the needle in from the rear, which is generally not recommended with other airbrushes that have traditional needle chucks. Pulling the needle out, I can see that they installed the 0.24 millimeter needle at the factory. When I disassemble the trigger spring assembly and pull it out, you can see some really cool rifling that's been machined into this, which is supposedly to help keep lubrication within that assembly and keep everything moving freely. The tension of the trigger is dictated by how far you screw down this kind of collet here or housing. The further down you screw it, the more resistance there is in the trigger, and the further out it is, the less resistance on the trigger. At the front of the airbrush, we have this kind of needle guard, which protects the needle when you're using the airbrush. It's kind of cool on this Harder and Steenbeck. You can rotate it to any kind of orientation you want. Taking off the front end of the airbrush doesn't require any kind of tools, and you can see here that the nozzle is nestled here within the front end. This is a new nozzle designed by Harder and Steenbeck. It's made out of titanium. You can kind of see the fluting or the slits along the side that have been cut. That's where the air charges through the front end. And at the bottom, you see the white seal. And that seal is resistant to solvents, so it should stand up to any kind of solvent paints just fine. And again, it's a toolless front end. You just screw it on by hand, tighten it down, and that white seal will make a good seal for the needle. You can just take the cups off by twisting them off, putting a new cup on. And this proved to be difficult for me, I suppose. Sometimes you gotta run it backwards to get the thread to catch. Screw it on. I believe this is kind of unique to Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes as well. Not a lot of other companies have interchangeable paint cups. You can put a smaller one on there. The advantage of having the smaller cup on there is that you can see your work if you're looking from the back of the airbrush. When I use the airbrush, I kind of use it like shooting a bow, where I'm not really looking straight down the arrow. I'm kind of looking at the side to figure out where the paint is going to land. So that's not a huge deal to me. But I'm going to put the needle back in, and you can see here that I can just put the needle in this needle collet from the back, push it in, and you feel some resistance. And that's going to be the needle packing screw, the seal. I always like to do a few trigger pulls once I put the needle back in and make sure it's all moving freely. And put the rear guard back on, and you can see that through the rear guard that you can actually access the trigger spring adjustment, which is a really cool feature. And the last feature I'm going to cover here is the trigger. This is probably my favorite trigger I've ever used on an airbrush. I've used a lot of airbrush triggers, and sometimes when you use an airbrush trigger for a long time, like 1 to 2 hours, it can cause a lot of pain and discomfort in your finger and create blisters. This trigger is very large, it feels very comfortable, and it makes it feel like I'll have more control when I'm using it. Earlier in the video, I talked briefly about the size of the airbrush. My impressions were that it was going to be larger than the other brushes I own. I'm pulling some of the other airbrushes I own out to help you visualize the size of the airbrush compared to some pretty common ones. Above it, we have the Iwata Eclipse HPCS. Above that, we have GSI Krios PS270. And then below that here, we're going to pull out the GSI Krios PS771. You can see that the Infinity is pretty small compared to other ones. Another thing I noticed about the Infinity is how short the front end is. Now that we've gone over the features of the airbrush through the unboxing and compared it to some of the other airbrushes visually, I'm going to swap over to the booth here where we're going to paint this purple worm. This worm has already been primed black, so I'm going to do some white zenithal priming on it. I put some Dollar Roundy white ink into it, do a few quick test sprays there on the palette, and then get to spraying the model. I chose to do white zenithal priming because if anybody's ever used white ink or white paints to an airbrush before, you know that they can get very chalky and create a lot of speckling on the model. So I like to use it kind of as a benchmark or a test for an airbrush because it really kind of shows you how well it's atomizing the paint. If it's doing a poor job, you're going to see a lot of like splotchy speckling on the model. If it's doing a really good job atomizing the paint, you're not going to see much texture at all. You're just going to see the shade of paint or the filter of paint put on top of what was underneath it. So testing this out, I'm going to be kind of testing out further away, kind of testing out closer, doing a little higher pressure. There doesn't seem to be any kind of issues with spider webbing, anything like that. It seems the paint comes out consistent. I didn't see any kind of visual speckling on the model, so I'm very happy with the results so far. I also like to test the airbrush here. I'm doing a little bit on the cardboard in the booth here. I've read and seen that the good test for an airbrush is doing starts and stops. Like if you're doing lettering, if it's a bad performing airbrush, you'll get big splotches where you start a line. That's kind of hard to prevent if it's not a well-designed airbrush. I'm doing these letters and these starts and stops, so I was very pleased. It seemed like I had really good control over the start and stop. I didn't end up with any big splotches at the beginning of my spray. I also do some fine detail work here to see how fine of a line I can get with this needle in it. This is the 0.24 millimeter needle. That all seems great. You know, things with airbrushes, you got to really kind of put them through the paces to see how well they do after they've been used for a while. So that will come later in a full review video. But I have to say, overall, I'm impressed. I'm kind of a gearhead myself, and I was really tuned in to the developments they were doing on this airbrush. And I honestly believe that it is probably one of the most developed airbrushes on the market currently. I'm not sure if any of the other manufacturers are really pushing development like Harder Steenbeck is currently. And so I'm kind of really excited about that. Let me know what you guys think. And we're going to dump this paint out, which should be fairly quick because we can use the quick release on the needle stop on the back of the airbrush here. We pop this out. And now we can pull the trigger all the way back. And with that paint out of there, we're going to go clean this thing and put it away.